Hello, what's up, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing the process behind this painting of a cabin in a winter landscape. So over on my Instagram, I actually asked if there was anything specifically anyone wanted to know about the process behind this painting, and I got so many good responses, and that is what is going to guide what I talk about in this video today. Generally, all of the responses fell under 4 different categories. The first was the planning process. The second was what order did I paint things in. The third was texture techniques that I used. And the fourth was just my own inner thoughts and dialogue as I was painting this painting. So I guess I'll start with the planning process. So many people wanted to know what my planning process was, and my gut reaction when I saw those responses were that I didn't have one. I just thought, oh, I just sat down and started painting. But I do now when I think back on it and I really put some thought behind it. There was planning, there was decision. I guess I just think about planning like, oh, I sat down and I outlined, but that's not always true. I think that we, in some way, even if we don't write it down, we do sort of have a plan of action as something that we think about before we get started. And it was really nice to be asked that because it really forced me to think about what it was I thought about before I sat down and started painting. So I'm going to share with you some of the things I thought about in my planning. And so I'm going to call it planning because that's what I guess it is, but I had a loose plan, and there were 2 sort of main big ideas I had as I sat down to paint this. And the first one was knowing that I wanted to do this with warm colors. And I know that sounds funny. That's not really part of a plan, but it is part of a decision that you make in the process of starting a painting. And so I knew that despite the fact that the reference photo for this painting is cold or has cooler colors to it, I knew that I wanted to approach it and add warmer colors in. I don't know really why or where that came from. Perhaps it was just being inspired from watching other videos lately of snowy painting scenes or winter scenes where, there's a lot of talk of, even though it's winter and even though it's cold, there's still warmth in the light of the painting. And I do believe that to be true. And I think that this reference photo just happens to be edited in a way that might look a little bit cooler. But if you look really close, there's still warm tones in there. There's some browns, deep browns, and so I wanted to bring that out. And so I knew that it's as part of my plan. I just knew I'm going to be using some warm colors as the base, and I knew also that I wanted to have a limited palette for this just to keep the decisions more simple. So I guess that is another version of having a plan. And so I knew I wanted to use 3 or 4 colors, also inspired lately by some of the other investigations I've been making, just things I've been seeing lately. I don't think it's a coincidence that these things have been showing themselves to me, either other artists that have limited palettes, or I just stumble upon YouTube videos where they're using limited palettes, and I myself have been wanting to just take a look again at the palette I have and look at what I really use and whether or not I can simplify it more or just be more intentional about the colors that I keep in my palette. And so I knew I wanted to use a limited palette again. And that was part of the decision-making process. And then another part of the plan was that I knew that I wanted to paint this really loose and really wet. It is a style that I have been working on personally and wanting to improve on. I just love the way it looks. I love the act of how it feels when I paint loose and wet, and I want to get better at it. I want to really be a lot more intentional about it. Sometimes when I do it, it feels a little bit chaotic still because I'm not quite sure what order to paint everything in. And I guess that helps me talk about the next category that people ask the most about, which is what order did I paint things in? And like I said, I don't always feel very confident about what order to paint things in. Sometimes the painting takes over and I react to what it needs at that moment. But as part of the plan and also as part of, the order that I painted things in this time, I did have the intention that I would be painting this from light to dark. So that is nothing new to watercolors, but it's something for me that I never really intentionally did as much before, and I want to try and do a little bit more now just to see if it helps my technique. So, again, the order of the layers then becomes pretty simple in its basic form. It's working from the lightest layer to the darkest layer. And that sounds really easy, but it is kind of hard, right? It's tricky. And the way I thought about it when I approached it in this particular painting was that I was going to paint the color of the light, so the warm light first, and protect those areas as I continued building darker layers. So you can see that actually my first layer was the sketch and masking fluid. And masking fluid becomes that first layer before I lay anything else down because I knew I wanted to protect certain parts of the snow that were going to be really hard to paint around. And that includes the cluster of trees on the left of the cabin, the branches that are just above the roof. I really wanted to accentuate a couple of those branches. And then on the right side of the cabin, there's a couple of little areas of masking fluid I added. And I was really strategic about it because I did think about how, I do have the ability, if I wanted to mask off the entire snow-capped roof and the front foreground of the snow and just make sure it gets all protected. But I didn't want it to be stark white. I just wanted certain areas that were going to be difficult, like I said, to protect, to be masked off. And that was the intention. I didn't know if it was going to work out, but I wanted to try it. And so that is the area I masked. And then I moved on to do the layers that were the lightest. So again, I painted the light areas. So you can see my first wash was all just a warm sort of yellow, a really light yellow. It went over the sky, a little bit over the roof of the cabin, and then obviously into the foreground. And then subsequently I then covered it up with another layer that had the kind of middle value grays and even the sort of middle value of the base of the cabin wood. And then I just continued by layering even darker and darker just details. So I darkened areas of the trees in the background that needed it, and then I started layering in details. So the cabin is also layered. So it happens in different stages, and the stages of the layers not only have to do with the lightness of them or the value, but they also have to do, for me, with the level of wetness on the paper. So I'm working with wet paper, it's damp and it's never really completely dry. And so I am working with the areas that are ready to be worked on. If they weren't ready or if the whole thing was just too wet, I would come in with a little bit of a blow dryer and do that just to help speed up the process. But hopefully that helps explain sort of the layers that happened and how I decided to work on them. I know it is, like I said, is tricky. It's tricky for me too. A lot of times it's a little bit of guesswork. I'm not really quite sure if I'm doing it right and I adjust as I go. So then I will move on to the textures, the background trees and the cabin specifically. There are dry brush techniques used. So as I'm painting, as the painting's getting more and more dry, I'm able to use more dry brush technique. And I definitely knew I was going to do that for the background trees because I don't want to literally paint all of the branches. I want to show and represent that there's something back there, but not have to paint all of the sticks. And I did use dry brush technique there. I feel like it worked pretty well at the tops of the trees. You can see they're just kind of soft and textured, and it just helps give you the idea that there's a tree there, or rather a lot of trees. And then by adding in strokes that tell you that there are trunks and branches. Your mind can put it together. And the same thing for the cabin wood. So it happened in layers, and as you saw, the lightest layers go down first. And so as I subsequently add dry brush technique to the top, I just make my paint mix a little bit darker in tone. So it's like the same color, it's just more concentrated. And so then I can brush on a couple of strokes, and it just makes it look like wood, but it's not really exactly a specific literal representation of it. But it helps the viewer and to understand what it is. So I guess this is a great way to end with a couple of final thoughts and inner dialogue that I had while I was finishing this up. And I didn't really think that this was that successful. To be honest with you, I almost didn't share it. The only reason I shared it was because I asked Instagram, and most people had said that they would like to see this as a video, so I'm here recording this. But the reason why I didn't really love the direction it took is that I wanted it to be looser. And I think that's the thing that gets us a lot of times, is that we paint something, and when we start, we do have some idea of how we want it to turn out, a vision, right? And we may or may not know what the plan is to get there. Like me, I did have a plan when I looked back on it, but when I sat down to paint, it didn't feel like I had a plan, because sometimes we just don't know what's going to come out. We don't know if what we want to come out of us is actually going to come out of us and end up on the paper. And we have this idea of what we want it to look like. And oftentimes when it doesn't come out that way, then we feel like it's not a great painting. And I think that's, sort of what happened to me here. I had this vision of what I would like it to look like, very, very loose and just less detailed than I painted it. And I just, I think it's normal. I think it's human nature to want to paint what we see exactly. And so it's easy to default into painting details more than we want. And actually, I think it's harder to pull back and simplify. I don't know if it's because there's a safe zone, there's a sense of safety in getting into the details, but maybe that's only true for me. I don't know. I can only speak for myself, really. And I just want to challenge myself to continue simplifying and paint looser and more free, I guess, is the best way to describe it. And if that makes sense. And I think that's it's just not something that happened in this painting. And objectively, maybe it's not a terrible painting. It looks like a cabin. The colors turned out nicely. There are definitely parts of it that I love, and I think that there are always lessons that we learned every time we paint. So there's no wasted painting. So I don't think that this was a wasted painting at all. I just had a different vision for it, and I wanted it to be looser and more free. And I think I'm slowly getting there. And the more I paint, every time I get these reminders that, maybe I could have used a larger brush or more bold and intentional strokes, and not to continue to work at areas. Anyways, I hope that these final thoughts, I hope that this video, along with, some of the answers to the questions I received, was helpful. And I cannot wait to share the next one with you.